Hello everybody, and welcome to our Wave of Light structure deck release week. This week we're going to be doing some videos where we just want to talk about some of the different ways you can build your deck if you've just gone past the base structure deck and you want to get a little bit more out of it. And we're going to be gradually increasing the difficulty level of the videos and what the decks can do over the week, and we thought we could just go over some fun stuff that you guys could try with this new structure deck. So for our first day of this week, we're going to be taking a look at what happens when you combine 3 copies of the Wave of Light structure deck, and we're going to be taking a look at some of the initial synergies and things that you can get out of it, which will get you straight into your first tournaments and having a bit of a good time. So for our first deck, we're going to be looking at combining 3 Wave of Light structures and adding a few additional cards. We'll go first through the deck list and then we'll talk about our options. So first of all, we're playing 3 Minerva, Scholar of the Sky. This is one of the new cards for the structure deck. It's extremely powerful and lets you recycle trap cards, counter trap cards from your graveyard. It becomes very important with some of the loops you can perform that eventually keep your opponent out of the game, which we'll explore a little bit later. We're going to be playing 2 copies of the Sacred Arknight Parsaf. This card is extremely powerful and sets you up for a drop loop. Drastic Drop Off loop, which I'll explain a little bit later in the video. This card is extremely powerful in the sense that it always gives you presence as long as you can banish the fairies from the graveyard to special summon it when you play a counter trap. It also pierces, so it puts your opponent in a position where it's very hard to defend against. It's actually super interesting because this is not a card that you ever really want to draw in your opening hand, so that you can actually play around with your build a little bit and decide whether or not you want to increase or decrease the number of this card. We'll go over an alternative option to this card a little bit later, because we're very rarely summoning it from our hand, we're mostly summoning it from our deck. We're actually going to play 2 copies of Bountimus Artemis. You can take this up to 3, it's a preference thing. It depends on what you are trying to get your deck to do. With the emphasis on focusing on Minerva for this deck, I've only elected to play 2 Bountiful Artemis. However, it's perfectly acceptable to go all the way up to 3. I find that this card actually changes your counter trap decisions a little bit if you want to focus more on Bountiful Artemis, because you need things to respond to your opponent's normal summon or your opponent's attacks. So, depending on preference, I'm currently going for 2, but you are very welcome to adjust that if you need to. We've got Meltiel, the Sage of the Sky. We're playing 2 copies of this card. This goes really well with Minerva because both of these cards have the requirement that to get the most out of them, you require the Sanctuary in the Sky. Meltiel gives you the ability to remove your opponent's cards and gives you a life point refund every time you play a counter trap. So for Solemn Strike, for example, you get 1,000 life points back, means you're only paying 500 for an extremely powerful effect. Having the ability to also remove your opponent's cards on top of that gives you a lot of disruption in your opponent's turns and means you're getting even more out of your counter traps than what you'd expect. We are playing only 1 copy of Guiding Ariande. Prior to the update for Master Rule 4, I would have said there is no reason to not play 3 copies of this card. Since we're focusing on the Sanctuary in the Sky to make the most of our Minerva, we end up actually using up a lot of our spell and trap zones with the new continuous spell, which we'll go over a little bit later. This actually prevents you from setting as many responses that you need to. So I've actually reduced the Guiding Ariande, naturally relying on Meltiel's life point gain to refund you the costs for most of your counter traps. Unfortunately, we do, by only playing 1 of these, lose out on having frequent access to a way of not having to pay discard costs. But again, you are free with your build, depending on which kind of traps that you want to include, to make adjustments. A card that's actually not included in the structure deck that we are including 4 free copies of is Zeraldus, Herald of Heaven. This card is actually extremely powerful in this deck. It was actually surprisingly so. I'd also like to take a minute to thank Will Lucas. I did not have ultimate rares for this video. He was kind enough to actually send them in to appear, so there you are, my friend, 1 shout out for you. So the reason I really like this card is we're not actually playing Terraforming, which is very crazy in a deck where you are naturally playing 3 copies of a field spell. But the Zeraldis in this deck fills a couple of extra things that Terraforming just can't do. Zeraldis can count as a fairy when you're using it to banish as a material for your Sacred Arcanite Parsaf. It acts as an additional fairy for Ties of the Brethren, a spell card we're going to be looking at a little bit later. And it also gives you like a 2400 attack monster in some circumstances that you can just normal summon and attack with. It's surprisingly strong in this deck when it doubles up some of your other costs. The last monster we're playing is Honest. Honest is a nightmare for your opponents to attack into your monsters for. Honest also makes Bountiful Artemis much more likely to survive the battle phase. One of the worst things that can happen is you set your free responsive counter traps, summon a Bountiful Artemis, your opponent just normal summons a monster that's got 1800 attack, runs over your Artemis, and then starts making their plays, and all of a sudden every counter trap you play is going to leave you in a worse and worse position the more times that you are forced to use them. So we're going to just play our one copy of Honest in this deck. We're going to go on to our spell cards next. As I've mentioned before, we're playing our 3 Sanctuaries in the Sky. On its own, it doesn't really do anything, it just prevents you from taking battle damage when your fairies are involved. Sometimes this can buy you time, but in most competitive Yu-Gi-Oh matches, you're generally finding that your monsters are being removed, and these are direct attacks on your life points. So the effect not so relevant here, but it's the key part about this is there's quite a few cards in the deck that depend on you controlling this card. We're also, by extension, playing 3 copies of the Sanctum of Parsaf. This gives us a total of 6 copies of the Sanctuary in the Sky card in our deck. You could even argue that it's 9 with Zeraldis in the deck. The Sanctum of Parsaf is a super cool effect which stops your face-down spells, stops face-down spells and traps on both sides of the field from being targeted. It gives an attack boost, so it can also bring your Bountiful Artemis up to 1900, making it much harder for it to just get a normal summon to attack over it. And it also has the effect where it lets you put 3 fairies or counter traps on top of your deck in any order. You can then use your various effects to draw these off the top of your deck in the order that you want. But one of the key things about it is to make sure that you don't run out of resources once you've got the game in control. You can keep making sure you're putting your powerful counter traps back to the top so that then each time it exchanges a card with your opponent, when your opponent is trying to scramble to get anything going. Ties of the Brethren is our next 3 of in this deck. Extremely powerful card. If you resolve it, it immediately gives you a dangerous setup for your opponent to start with. Because it means you can start with any of your level 4 fairies, with the exception of Zeraldis if you haven't already got your Sanctuary in the Sky. You're going to play this and then you're going to be able to get a Bountiful Artemis and a Minerva or a Meltiel and onto the field. And then this means that all of your counter traps all of a sudden are now pulling you 3 additional effects every time you use them, and it can quickly let you snowball the game into your favor. Extremely powerful. Comes with a steep 2000 life point cost. This card will help you regain some of your life as you're using your counter traps to offset this. And of course, you can always use the Sanctum of Parsaf to put fairies back on top of your deck so that you can always make sure that you've got a Ties of the Brethren targets in your deck. Next, we're playing 2 copies of Pot of Desires. This is what I really like about this card in this deck is because of Sanctum of Parsaf, you can put resources from your graveyard back on top of your deck so that you can get away with playing more and not running your deck out. Unfortunately, whenever you play Pot of Desires, it does adjust the ratios of monsters you should be playing for things that you don't want to banish. It forces you to play more free elves, which removes the amount of variety that you can put in a deck. However, just drawing 2 additional cards without actually having to give any of your active resources, meaning cards in your hand or on your field, is extremely powerful in this deck. And again, because we've got the Sanctum of Parsaf, we can avoid running ourselves completely out of cards as long as we can keep finding uses for our counter traps. The next part we're going to go into are our counter traps of choice. We're playing 3 copies of the Rebirth of Parsaf. This card is extremely strong. Unfortunately, the drawback for this is results in you having to play very, very weirdly. So in order to activate it, you have to reveal a counter trap from your hand. Then you can discard a card. It doesn't have to be the same card you revealed. You get to negate any action your opponent does, so it's a very open counter trap in that regard. It can negate effects, spells, and traps. Then you get to summon a Parsaf monster from your deck or your extra deck. which means we can also get away with playing our Avenging Knight Parsaf. Now, if you've just got into Yu-Gi-Oh! And this is your first deck that you're trying to take seriously, or you've not got a lot of extra deck monsters, you can play this deck without any extra deck monsters, but I would strongly recommend that for each copy of the Rebirth of the Parsaf card you're playing an equal number of either Avenging Knights or Sacred Arc-Knights. Since you can special summon straight from the extra deck and we're not making a lot of other summons, it's essentially a free monster zone that we get to summon to. Being very open and having the option to negate everything your opponent does whilst also establishing a major threat makes it an extremely powerful card. My favourite counter trap in the entire deck, and one that we're going to be discussing a little bit for our strategy, is Drastic Drop Off. Now, this is a card that you can activate anytime your opponent adds a card to their hand or draws a card. The key thing with this is the timing that you use it. If, depending on your setups, you may be deciding to just use this immediately when your opponent draws a card. This gives you information from your opponent. You also get to take the card away that they've drawn, which becomes relevant once you've simplified the game into your opponent is scrambling for resources and you know they couldn't answer something you did in a previous turn. So if you take away their only draw for the turn, they're probably not going to be able to deal with it this turn. If you're not in that situation, you're going to be looking at the key times when your opponent searches for that clutch card, and then you can take it out of their hand. We'll go over this in a while, but let's just fill out the rest of our counter traps. So next we're playing one of the strongest counter traps ever printed, Solemn Strike. We're playing full free copies, negating special summons or negating monster effects for 1500 life points, extremely strong. Again, it triggers Banner with Artemis, which gives you additional cards. Meltiel can gain you life points back, so you end up only paying 500 and then take out an additional card in the exchange. And also Minerva, it's a great card to recur, and you've got a lot of activation windows because most players are now building their decks towards monster effects, and so that you generally always have an opportunity to use this. Next up, we're playing 3 copies of Divine Punishment. This is another very open-ended counter trap. You can only activate it if you control a Sanctuary in the Sky, which you have 6 copies of right here. But once you've got it in play, it negates almost any action that your opponent does, monsters, spells or traps. And this then triggers additional cards, and then also with Minerva you can then switch between Divine Punishment and Drastic Drop Off. So your opponent's option shrinks every turn, because you're always going to have their opponent's draw phase to act, which gets you these back, which then negates another card, and your opponent stops seeing resources, and eventually you just take control of the game. We're playing our 1 copy of Solemn Warning. This is extremely strong against any type of summon, including normal summon. If you want to build your deck more around Battle with Artemis, you're going to need more normal summon responses. As I mentioned before, one of the problems is with particularly this kind of lineup is that your opponent could just normal summon, say, Spiral Super Agent, and then just attack over your monster, then start making their plays, and all of a sudden you've lost your ability to gain additional cards. Solemn Warning allows you to deal with the normal summon, and it's quite open-ended that it lets you respond to special summons as well. One of the key things to be successful with this deck is having open-ended cards to deal with your opponent's resources when you don't know what they have, and then using your specific resources at key moments. The last 2 trap cards I've included in this deck are 2 copies of Storming Mirror Force. These are very, very strong at protecting your Bantimus Artemis, your Minervas, your life points. Is pretty open-ended when your opponent declares an attack. Also, Link monsters can't avoid it because they can't switch into defense mode, so you can clear fields out quite easily, and thanks to the Sanctum of Parsaf, while this card's face down, it's not going to get targeted or destroyed by an opponent's card. Which means that you're going to have quite a large window to force your opponent to play into it. So that's the basis of the deck. So to talk about some of the stuff like I mentioned earlier, for example the Drastic Drop Off loop, once you get yourself into a situation where you're in control of the game, which could be, say we negate one of our opponent's cards with Rebirth of Parsaf, and we summon the Sacred Arc-Knight of Parsaf. Our opponent then, throughout the rest of their turn, fails to destroy this. This signals that your opponent does not have an answer to this card right now. This is always going to inflict damage when it attacks because it pierces. By running over one of your opponent's defense monsters or just attacking them directly, you can then search your deck for a Drastic Drop Off. Since your opponent didn't have an answer last time, there's a strong possibility they do not have an answer this time. That means you catch them with Drastic Drop Off and they're in the same situation they were last turn. they can't answer your monster, and your monster is a threat that they must deal with. So you get to attack basically 3 times, and your opponent doesn't get a draw step, draw phase to work with. And this is generally enough time for you to just win the game when you've got a piercing monster and you've got additional monsters you can consider. You can also get them into the position with these kinds of Drastic Drop Off loops with Minerva by negating with Divine Punishment and switching over to Drastic Drop Off to keep shrinking their resources. Minerva then gets stronger and stronger each time that this cycle goes on. If your opponent then still for some reason after 3 turns have held on, you can also use the Sanctum of Parsaf to put the Drastic Drop Offs back on top of your deck to make sure that your opponent doesn't see any cards. For anybody who's playing way back when, you may remember what it felt like when Yatagarasu successfully direct attacked you, and you can put your opponent in a similar situation. It's also important to note that Drastic Drop Off is a spell speed free card, so it means if your opponent draws their Twin Twister for the turn, and you use Drastic Drop Off, your opponent can't chain to that. So that's a cool, another neat interaction to consider. So I think that's a good example of the combining 3 decks and just adding a few additional cards from some of our other products. This will get you off to a great start, and again, this is completely customizable. You can focus more on, say if you wanted to bring in more Guiding Ariandes, then you'd want to consider bringing in Ultimate Providence, which is a card we're going to look at in our next deck. There's actually something else I want to show you guys, which we'll just move this away while we're here. So if you want to start going out there with this type of deck, which you absolutely can, we have, just bear with me one moment there guys, just move this. We do have a card, when you've got a card like Sanctum of Parsaf that changes cards on top of your deck, you can play fruity things such as the True Name. Because you know the top card of your deck, you'll declare it correctly. You get to grab that card, and then you can grab your highlight reel card of choice. It's something fun. You're probably not going to get away with that in a regional, but you pull that one off on your friends, they're going to be quite surprised to see a good card out of nowhere, especially when it's backed up with a lot of counter traps. To discuss some pros and cons to this deck, one of the major pros is because you've got so many open-ended counter trap cards, you've got a lot of control over your opponent's actions, and you benefit from knowing how your opponent plays the game. You are in a very strong position. The problem with this deck is when you are going second and your opponent establishes a field, you'll notice with this base deck that there's not a lot of ways to completely disrupt an established field, with the exception of Storming Mirror Force. Now you can make adjustments to your deck if you're quite uncomfortable with this, to add things such as Regeki or Dark Holes to your deck to give you some more room to play with. You're generally very heavily favored if you go first, and you're quite unfavored if you go second. But this is where you can make your side decking choices for tournaments to adjust for this. So that's going to do it for our first video today, guys. We hope you enjoyed that. Tomorrow we're going to be looking at something a little bit more out there, and we're going to be going a bit more into details with what we can do with our newest structure deck. Thank you so much for watching today, guys. We hope you enjoyed the video. If you'd like to give us any feedback, please leave your comments below. We're always looking for feedback on these types of videos so we can improve the content we deliver to you guys. We hope to see you on our channel in the near future. Have a great day.